Right here, and today we're going to start to ram up a Foundry mold. So the first major step to casting a meat tenderizer head is to have the actual block of aluminum to machine down. So we're going to show this process here. It is labor intensive, it's filthy, so just a couple things to be aware of once you go to do this. So some of the parts you folks have looked at within reading the chapter. First off, this is our flask. Both components of this here make the flask. There is a cope and a drag, and we'll explain those in just a quick minute. We said these are riddles. They are sort of like a cheese grater. We're going to take our sand, we're going to push it through the riddles to make sure there's no particulates or any kind of other foreign objects in the sand. It's also going to break it up a little bit for us. Right here we have two different types of rams. We have an aluminum ram and we also have a wooden ram. So I prefer the aluminum one a little bit better. It has a little weight to it. It's a little bit heavier, so it makes things move a little bit quicker. So that's an option. We have this thing here. It's called our slick and oval. We talked about that in the textbook. If you didn't see it today, you will see that whenever you get to that portion of the chapter. That's kind of what we use to dig and move around the sand as we're going. A couple brushes here if we need to brush sand out of the way. We also have these two tubes here. Those are going to be used to cut our sprue and our riser. This here is our sample pattern we're going to use to cast that meat tenderizer head. So basically I have two pieces of steel that are bolted to this piece of plywood, and that's what we're going to base our mold off of. So once we pack the sand in, finish it, we pour it, we'll have two blocks of aluminum this size to use for your project. So if you'd like to partner up with somebody, you're welcome to do that. If you'd like to do it by yourself, that's fine. Reason I say do it by yourself, if one gets screwed up during the process where we pour this off, you now have a backup one. And if you don't need that, we can just melt that down later. It's not that big of a deal. If you pair up with somebody, you work on this together. If one does not come out, you're still gonna have to obviously get that process done. Below, you can't see inside of here, there is Foundry sand. We use what's called Petrobond sand in here. So it's a sand with an oil in it. There is no water in this sand. It does talk about green sand molds in the textbook, but that's a water base, and we don't really get into that. The Petrobond packs a little bit tighter. I prefer that. It's a little bit easier to use. The last thing we have right on top is this bag right here. This is called parting compound. It's a very fine, it's almost like talcum powder, but it's not talcum powder. Okay, so as I bounce this thing around, you'll see the dust falling out. It's sort of like a rosin bag if you play baseball or if you're familiar with that. So we kind of keep it in that coffee can just to keep the dust and stuff inside of there. So we will start in just 1 second. Okay, now at this stage of the game, we're going to start to ram up our mold. Now, I have instructions in regards to ramming up a mold and how to prepare that. There's a Foundry procedure sheet. I'm going to throw that on Classroom so you folks have it. I'm going to go through and say the number and the step as I complete it. And that way, if you miss part of the demonstration, you need to review part of the demonstration, we can refer to that number and then move forward from there. So the first step of this process, select the pattern and correlating flask you're going to use for the Foundry project. So we did pull our flask out, we have that. We also have our molding board here that has our two blocks of steel mounted to it. Step number 2, separate the flask over the Foundry bench. Place the cope on the bottom, pattern in the center, and drag on top. The drag has pins that should be pointing downward. So right now, if this sits, I actually have it upside down. We can have it like this. Okay, so we have this portion here. We have our cope on the bottom, and our drag is on top. Pins pointing downward. Now, one thing we need to be aware of when we go to do this, we need to have this flask totally cleaned out. There can't be any kind of leftover sand or anything of that nature inside of there. So take a slick and oval. I want you to take and scrape this thing out. Make sure it's going to sit perfectly flush. And make sure there's no remaining sand. That could cause problems later down the road. So we'll give us a quick brush. You can see some of the sand coming out. It's a tap here. Okay, so we have that cleaned up. So we have our cope and our drag are cleaned out. We are ready to start to assemble this thing. So we're going to take our molding board, we're going to set that on top, and we want to take our drag, put that through. The alignment pins are going to go through the board and into the cope, and that's all going to lock together. Now, I also take and set my flask on top of a piece of plywood, and that way, as I start to ram this thing and whatnot, the entire thing isn't jumping all over the place. It's going to jump around a little bit, but this will help kind of keep those reverberations down. So, step number 3, place a light coating of parting compound over the top of the pattern and the pattern base. So, let me do this here. So, our parting compound goes on next. So we're going to grab this, like I said, think of it like a rosin bag for baseball. You're going to take this, you're going to bounce that around inside the flask, and you're going to see that light coating of dust coming out of that bag. This step is very important. If we do not do this step, the mold will not release when we go to separate these. When the mold doesn't release, it pulls the sand off. When it pulls the sand off, we usually have to re-ram the mold up. If that's the case, you're not going to be a happy camper. You'll be upset with yourself for not doing that correctly. Step number 4, set the riddle on top of the drag and fill the riddle with sand. Sift all sand completely through. So I'm going to take a riddle. We're going to set this on top. Now I need to get sand from down inside the pit up into the riddle. A couple different ways to do this. My suggestion, there are several buckets underneath this Foundry bench. Fill a bucket of sand up, bring it up next to the riddle and the flask, and we will work out of that. There's also a small flat shovel in here. So grab your flat shovel, grab some sand, and we will take and put that sand directly into the riddle. Okay? Some people try to shovel from the bottom of this Foundry bench to the top, and there's sand all over the floor. If the sand gets caught in your shoes and you eventually walk home, your folks are going to be furious because that sand has oil in it and it's a reddish color. You'll take and walk through the house. If they have white carpet, you're going to see red footprints and it's going to get ugly. So don't do that. Okay? So we're going to get some sand inside of a riddle. Now we're going to take, I'm going to clump this together, and we're going to, almost like a cheese grater, we're going to take and run that sand through to get it through the riddle. Okay, the sand does have kind of a weird smell to it, has a weird texture to it, has a burnt oil smell. So we're going to take this and we're going to riddle some sand through there. Every now and again you will come through some debris that's inside the sand. If you do come across something, pull that stuff out. You may find a little chunk of metal, a little piece of wood, different things like that. You don't want that stuff sticking in your hand, so do yourself a favor. If there's chunks of stuff, pull that out, and that way you're not fighting with that. Okay, a couple more shovels here. So ideally what we want to do with this, we want to take and fill our drag almost to the top with that grated sand. So you probably can't see it from where you're at. I'm going to move this over, but this is starting to fill up a little bit. We'll continue to riddle that sand through. If it gets to the point where it's not going through anymore, just take your fingers, take your hand. We'll push that sand around inside of the mold and place it where it needs to go. So we're going to move some sand around because right now it's starting to get a little dicey here. So we're going to take, very lightly, we're going to take that sand, just kind of move that around. And because it is starting to fill up, we're going to look at the next step. It says, lift the riddle and carefully press the sand down with your fingers. I'm just going to take my hand, real nice and easy. We're just going to take and just start to push that sand down a little bit. That'll give us more room to add more sand. So we'll do a few more riddles here, and then we will begin the ramming process. let's do that. A little more sand in here. This side takes the longest. The pattern side always takes the longest because that's all the sand that we have to put through this riddle. On the other side, there's basically no pattern. We'll do just a little bit of riddled sand, and the rest we're just going to shovel in and ram in. So this part here is the probably more time-consuming side, if you will. Now, people ask, where is a foundry used? What do they still do foundry work for? There's actually a foundry in Lawrenceville. I think it's about 32nd Street, 33rd Street, something like that. They actually make parts for train cars. So that's actually happening right in Lawrenceville. That's close by. It's called McConway and Torley. And they make couplers and things like that. And they basically cast all the products for that. So this is a process where you do that. Engine blocks for cars, control arms, any kind of part that's cast has to go through a process very similar to this. Now, obviously we're doing it by hand. Big industrial corporations, it's probably going to be automated. For here, we're doing the manual labor, so. Okay, so I have some riddled sand. We have just about topped off here. And we're at the point now where we can begin to ram this. So the sand is filling up. I'm going to grab this camera so you can see a little closer what it looks like. So you can see our riddled sand in here, and it's packed on pretty tight. Now, we need to have it tight enough so that when we go to pour this, the mold doesn't blow out. If the sand isn't packed in tight enough, once that hot molten aluminum hits it, it's going to push that mold apart. That aluminum is about 1,300 degrees when we go to pour it. We don't want to have a mistake happen during that, okay? It can be very dangerous, so we need to make sure we're on our game. We're going to take our riddle, we'll get this thing out of the way, hang that back up. It might fall off once we start to ram, but if it does, we'll just put it back. Okay, we're ready to ram this. I'm going to take the aluminum one. Like I said, I kind of prefer that. This will be number 7. Use the ram to pack the sand into the drag, using the pointed end around the edges of the drag and round end for the rest. So I'm going to start with the round end first. I'm going to get as much as I can. Then I'm going to flip to the pointed end, and I'm going to go through the rest of this. So grab this here. We want to do consistent pressure as we go to ram this mold up. We don't want to take and hit harder one spot than the other. If I pack the sand too tight on one side and pack it at a different tightness or a different packing on the opposite side, the sand is not going to stay in the mold, it's going to fall apart. So we don't want to do that. Okay, so we're going to take this. And start to, ram this. So I like to try and do a pattern. I'm going to go around the outside perimeter. Once I get through the outside perimeter, I'll start to work on the inside perimeter. Don't smash your finger, that hurts. Most of that's there. We're now going to take and ram our edges using the opposite side. So grab that pointed end. Let's get that in the corner. Flat side one more outside edges are rammed in. We didn't quite get to the center where our actual blocks of aluminum are. We need to add more sand to that. So basically what I'm gonna do with this is why I like to work out of a bucket. I can either shovel sand in or I can dump sand in. I'm just gonna shovel to try and keep this a little bit more together here, not make a total mess out of this. This sand is also expensive. It's roughly $60 for a 5-gallon pail. So the more sand that I lose in the trash after cleanup and things like that, you know, it starts to wear pretty quick. So we want to try and be judicious of that as we take the sand and put it inside. So this here, just a little bit more, and we'll ram this in here. So grab our ram back, just the same. And like I said, you want to sort of come up with a pattern. So I'll start in the middle, kind of work to the right, come back to the left, back to the right. I'll work towards myself here a little bit. Notice the sand is coming at you while you're doing it. Take your entire flask, push that towards the rear of the table, and that way we can keep the sand inside here. It's starting to bounce over and hit my shoes. So we'll do that. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Okay, so we got our flat going. We'll go back to our pointed edge. We'll check our corners again. Corners, we'll go back to our flat. Okay, so, you know, we're going to continue to ram this here. We need to do this until this is flush with the top. So, we're going to continue to add sand to this, ram it, continue that process. Once we get this thing topped off, we're going to take what's called a strike-off bar. We're basically going to cut across this thing on an angle and make sure this is totally flush with the top. Okay? So, we'll continue with the sand. Strike off bar. It's missing an action. We'll grab another piece of steel here. We'll find one in just a minute. It's floating around somewhere. We'll get it. Said add more sand. Don't need too much, so we're just going to kind of shovel it in here. sometimes we have clumps in the sand. You're going to want to take a shovel, chop them up a little bit. Okay. Get close here. Give it a little tap so it's not bouncing all over the place. More. If I wanted to, I could switch to the wooden ram. It doesn't really matter. Well, here, I'll switch to the wooden one so you can see what that looks like. Same process, same exact thing. Okay, so this is wooden. It is a little bit bigger on the outside edges. I guess you could cover more surface area with this. So there might be some less hits, I guess. So we'll go back. We'll start with the metal again. Get into those edges more. They're pretty well tightly packed. At this point in time, this is sticking up in the front. Rather than have the sand go all over the place, I'm going to rotate this around, and that way, so we keep the sand where we want it. Some of this other sand that's on the edges, you can take and put that back in. At this point, we're getting to the area where it's topped off. We need to strike this thing off. So we're going to get a piece of steel here, and we're going to strike this thing. We want to take in a sawing motion. Think of a saw. I'm going to start from the center. I'm going to push this way, away from me. I'm going to saw and pull towards me because there's a couple divots in here. So put this piece of angle right across the top, push down, and just like you're running a saw, we're going to take this, push forward nice and easy. And I'm going to stop right there. There's a couple divots on the outside edge of this that still need filled in with sand. So rather than have to shovel it back off, we're just going to let it sit there for a quick minute. Okay, I'm going to take this, bring it the opposite direction towards me. Like I said, there's a couple divots here. If you try just to pull it and scrape it, you're probably going to tear a lot of sand out. We don't want to do that. Okay, so give, like I said, sawing motion. And there's a divot right here, so we're going to take and ram this. So let's strike it, see where we're at here. And come our other direction, just the same. Little bit of a divot right here. You can see it's kind of roughed up a little bit. We're going to take just a little bit more sand. We'll add it to that. Some people say, why does that really matter? Can we just get away with that? What will happen is we're going to pour this thing off. when that molten metal hits that sand, any kind of indentation or whatnot, it'll take and try to push that sand out. We don't want that to happen, so we'll take re-ram just that little part, restrike it. Okay, so that's it. We got this couple spots. We can take a brush. We'll give this a light brush to remove anything loose that's kind of scattered across the top. It should be relatively tight. Now, what we want to do after this, there's a number for this. It says, repeat 6 and 7 until the drag is completely full. Number 9, use a strike-off bar in a sawing motion to cut the sand level with the top of the drag. Number 10, complete the thumbprint test to see if compaction is correct. So, we're going to take our thumb, and I'm going to be pushed on your flask as hard as you can. We do not want to put dents in this. If we can take and put a dent in it, that tells us that the sand is not packed tight enough. So I'm going to take my thumb. I wouldn't say as hard as you can. We don't want to try and, but you should not be able to put a thumbprint inside of here. So I did pretty good. I think that'll work for us, okay? Normally at this point in time, it would probably be towards the end of the class period, so we'd want to clean up. Now, the Foundry sand is all over my hands. This is not like beach sand. Like I said, it has oil in it. The first step of washing your hands after the Foundry, go over to the sink, grab paper towels, right over the garbage can. I want you to go back and forth. That'll take most of the sand off. The second thing, get your soap over there, 3 or 4 pumps of it, lather good, grab more paper towels, wipe your hands off. As soon as I take water and put it to this oil, it's not going to clean it off, okay? So soap, paper towels, do that a few times back and forth until all the crap is off your hands. Once that sand is off, then you can do soap, water, paper towels, okay? We also have hand cleaner here. You can also use that to clean yourself up, okay? So part 2, we'll start in just a quick minute here.